My name is Sean. I'm delighted you're joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today I'm joined by Steve from Microsoft, who will cover Lightning Talk, unlock SharePoint embedded integration with Power Platform connectors. We love hearing you guys have to say, so remember to join a conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESPC_community and our hashtag is hashtag ESPC26. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which updates the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking Content tab at the top. Join us for our next webinar, Developing, Testing, and Deploying SharePoint Framework Solutions with Success, with Peter Paul Kirchner, MVP, and Guido, MVP. Will happen tomorrow, Thursday at 11 CET. Don't miss out. Register today at www.sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. To celebrate 25 years of SharePoint, we're celebrating giving 25 people the chance to win 50% off their ESPC ticket. Simply use the QR code to enter your chance to secure a 4-day pass for €947.50 and a 3-day pass for €847.50. After the webinar, we'll have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have in the chat box. Questions will be selected and answered at the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to Resource Center. Will you be notified by email when it's available? And now I'm going to pass over to today's webinar presenter. Hello, Steve. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, sir. I'm going to go ahead and grab a window to share here. All right. And everybody should have me. Okay, great. Well, thanks, Sean. Great to be here, and always excited to see some of the photos and recapping the events that happened at ESPC. Such a fun time. So glad I could share the lightning talk that I presented there as well on SharePoint Embedded, how to use the new Power Platform connectors that are available now, GA. So this is going to be a bit of an overview on SharePoint Embedded initially for those of you that are new to the platform. But then we're going to get into some full-on demos on how we can use the connectors, some sample apps that I've created, things like that.
Steve, you're not sharing yet. Just let you know.
I'm not sharing yet. Let's do this one more time.
There you
And how about now?
Perfect.
Okay, cool. Excellent. So let me hide that guy. And I'm going to go back. So for those of you that I haven't connected with, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. Would love to see what everybody is up to. All right. From a SharePoint embedded perspective, those of you that are new to the platform, I wanted to set a bit of a context on how SharePoint embedded fits into your M365 environment and where that isolated boundary is. So within your M365 environment today, everybody's got SharePoint, everybody's got OneDrive. That's kind of the natural place that we've been going to store, collaborate on documents. What we have done is introduced a new primitive called SharePoint Embedded. And this is where the containers store your content at scale. So they are isolated from the SharePoint, the OneDrive environment. They do reside within your M365 platform. So all of the security compliance and so forth that we'll get into here in a bit are fully at play there. SharePoint Embedded is a graph-only interface. So there's no UX that you can go to navigate to the SharePoint Embedded containers. This is something that you would use within your custom applications. So if you're creating, React, C#, Java, whatever the case is there, anything that can call graph would work. Or, as we're going to find out here in a second, how do we use the Power Platform connectors to interact with those containers that store the content in Power Apps, in Copilot Studio, and so forth. So that's where we're going to start to focus a little bit more, but know that the containers in the SharePoint embedded environment that we talk about are certainly going to be a foundational concept that we need to understand. What SharePoint Embedded delivers is a whole bunch of goodness that you don't have to worry about. I'll start on the right-hand side with core storage. So think of this as that is where you're storing your documents. We can store up to 30 million documents, 25 terabytes per container. And we'll get into that container concept here in a second. Everything that you would suspect from an ECM perspective on managing documents recycle bin, metadata searching, supporting really any kind of file type up to 250 gigabytes is totally supported. So that core storage, it's not very exciting, but it's always something that we need to understand where it fits in and the scalability that it has. Where we see a lot of customers gravitating to SharePoint Embedded is specifically for the collaboration aspect of it. This is where, again, storing the document in that core storage containers within the platform allows you to now collaborate on documents real time. So this is no stripped down version of Office or anything like that. This is full on collaboration within the Office environment. So app mentioning, co-authoring, sensitivity labels, everything you would expect there just works. And there's also external collaboration. So we'll talk about what that means here in a second. On the compliance side, I mentioned sensitivity labels, but you've got really the full Purview suite at your disposal. So anything that you would configure in Purview that would normally work on SharePoint or OneDrive, SharePoint Embedded being that additional data estate where you're going to store documents. You absolutely don't want to lose control of where they're at. You want them to fit into that Purview investment that you've already made. It's there by default. So SharePoint Embedded is that first-class citizen that extends all of your configuration from Purview into those containers that hold your documents. And then, of course, Copilot. No discussion would be complete for Microsoft without a Copilot interaction. This is where we do have the ability to use those containers in a Copilot search. When you put the content into a container, that will go into the isolated SharePoint index only for SharePoint Embedded. That gets consumed into the semantic index so that you can reason over that content and only that content. Okay, so that's the important distinction. Again, heavy emphasis on isolated content from the rest of your tenant. And that's kind of what sets SharePoint Embedded apart a little bit more. All right, so we talked about this container concept. What is it? Literally what a container is one site collection with one document library. Under the hood, that's really what it is. But when you create your application, you can create millions of containers that hold 30 million documents each. So from a scalability perspective, that's pretty huge. The architecture of that really depends on your application. So I'll show you a project management application here in a second where I have decided that each project now becomes a container. I want that security boundary. I want control over the content that's in that container. I may want to share that with external vendors that are needed to add content to the container. And that gives me that security sharing boundary that I need. So that's, there's always a bit of an art and a science with architecture, and containers allow you to ebb and flow with that as well. Again, containers store the documents. They store the metadata that's associated to the documents. We'll see that here in a second as we get into a demo and what that looks like. So a lot of the similar functionality that you're used to in the SharePoint document library, very similar concept with containers. Again, graph enabled. That's the only way to see the content in the containers, graph permissions, getting access to there. You build your application, we take care of the rest. I like to say on the right-hand side, that's the super hard stuff. Nobody wants to configure or write an Entra authentication mechanism, right? Nobody wants to write Purview. Nobody wants to do some of that Copilot integration that we're putting together. That's like super hard stuff, like really, really hard stuff, and takes a long time to perfect it, a long time to integrate it across the entire data estate. So we have that you can use within your applications. Again, you build that application the way you want to. You want the user experience to react a certain way? Perfect. That's where Power Apps comes into play. That's where your custom app comes into play. Whatever you want to use to guide those users through that application and that business logic, that's really the important part. If you have line of business integrations, so think of Dynamics, think of Salesforce, think of SAP, where they do a specific function, but holding documents and managing documents, usually that's something, at least on the Dynamics side, we do in SharePoint. Now, SharePoint Embedded offers a more scalable solution and the ability to integrate that right within that line of business app. So you go to that account card within Dynamics, and you want to see all the contracts that are executed against that customer. those can be stored as SharePoint embedded, surfaced in your Dynamics environment using the connectors that we'll see here in a minute. And of course, that's where Power Platform comes into play. So SharePoint embedded, again, that isolated storage mechanism where you store your documents. Power Platform, that low-code environment that we know and love to configure that business logic. So if you're not a developer, I'm a developer, I love Power Platform. So now the ability to use first-party connectors with SharePoint embedded content is now generally available. So that's where things get super exciting. Before, because it's a graph endpoint, you could use the HTTP connection, but of course that's a premium connection. There's an additional charge for that. Now with the SharePoint embedded connectors, those are first party. There's no charge for the connector. There's only that API charge that you would use to get documents out and do those CRUD operations that we'll see here in a second. Okay. 47 connectors at your disposal. They are designed to do the majority of the CRUD operations that you have. Create, write, update, and delete. Instead of paying for the standard connector that I mentioned earlier, you're paying for that API call, which is literally a fraction of a cent. So build the agents on top of that. So this is where in Copilot Studio, you can go and build that agent with the tool functionality that it uses the SharePoint embedded connectors. So we'll absolutely see that here in a second. Power Apps, use it just like you would any other connector within Power Apps, Power Automate. You click a button on Power Apps to see all the containers. It makes that call to Power Automate, executes that connector, gets the containers from SharePoint embedded, and shows them on your screen as you want to in a gallery, a grid, table, whatever you decide. And I've got a demo that we'll walk through here in a second. From a payment perspective, it is all pay as you go. So there is no license that you need or anything like that. There is a subscription that you associate to your SharePoint embedded container as you create your application. That's how we know to bill you based on the storage and based on those API calls that you're going to execute. And of course, everything runs within the context of the user. So if I'm executing that, now it has security parameters for me. If I have a container that I don't have access to, I'm not going to see it, or I'm going to get an access denied as I'm trying to get the content from the container. So again, you've got control over that, but know that from a security perspective, we're taking care of that as well. Okay, so let's dive into what you can do from a SharePoint embedded perspective using Power Platform. Alrighty, so I've got a couple things that I have created so far that we're going to walk through and set the stage. So remember I mentioned that we have this concept of a Power App that I'm using to get all of my containers or my projects from my application. So I've created a new application specifically for projects. Now I'm creating containers and I'm looking at the files in those containers. So if I select my container, now I can see container type information, right? So this becomes pretty important. We're going to need that container ID so that as we go into reviewing some of the files, we need to have that container ID. Which project am I in so that I can see which files are associated to that? So that's going to become pretty important here in a second. But if I wanted to look at some of the permissions that are on that container, so the selected container that I have, now, I think I timed out here. Yeah, if I go into properties here, yeah, okay, so I can see the properties of the container. I can see the permissions if it didn't time out. Yeah, okay, so there's permissions that we can use as well. If I wanted to delete the container or create a new container. So as I'm creating my screens that interact with the user, always need to keep in mind what is the parameters of that graph endpoint that I need to pass to that connector. So you don't really need to know the graph details so much. But within the connector now, I have this container name, container description, and who's the admin. That's what the connector is going to require as I'm creating that interface, or that new container in this case. Okay. So I'm going to go to files here really quick, and then we'll get a little deeper into what that looks like. So if I refresh my containers, I can see that now I've got files for Project AdventureWorks. I've got files for Project Contoso. Again, making the API call or the connector call to the get files connector that I have. And now I can start to navigate or walk the tree. So if I can dig into the folders, for instance, here I have a folder that I've added some invoices to. If I wanted to edit a particular document, I can do that as well. All right, so let's walk through what that may look like from a connector perspective and from a population perspective. So I'm going to go back to my containers. So we've noticed that here is my grid for containers, and I'm going to focus on selecting, actually, I'm going to focus on what happens at startup, okay? So if I look at the startup activity, so on start, I have some population that I'm doing. So I'm navigating, basically setting the venue item. But in this case, I'm setting a collection for containers. And this is where I want to run that get containers power automate method to see what is in those containers. Okay. So if I go back to power automate, now I can see, there we go. Okay. So now I have a get containers option. And if I hit the edit button on this get containers, this is where I'm able to see what the parameter is that I'm passing in. So in this case, I don't really have any parameters that are coming from Power Apps. But what I do have is this connector from SharePoint Embedded that says, hey, go and get me those containers for my application or for my container type. So if I expand that, you can see that I have a new grouping for SharePoint Embedded. And that's where we see all of the activities that you can use for your Power Automate connections. So in this case, I want to list all the storage containers, but I may want to create a file. I may want to, list the versions. I may want to delete a file. Again, back to those CRUD operations that you're using. This would be something that you would want to, again, determine what that user experience is so that you can use the right connectors in your application. Okay. We also have triggers. So when a new file is added to a container, something happens, and then you can react to that event. Okay. So that's where I want to go next is I want to set this up so that we looked at the Power App that has my project information, but imagine that you have a vendor that needs to submit invoices into your project. They only have access to that specific project that you're working for, but you're doing this through Teams. So there's an interface or an agent that we have in Teams, allows you to drop that invoice into the chat window, fires off that Copilot Studio agent, will then consume that, put it into the appropriate container, but then it's going to pull the metadata information out of that invoice, populate the metadata in the container so that now we can use that downstream in accounting to pay for that invoice. So let's walk through what that configuration looks like. So you'll notice that I'm back in Teams, and I have created, again, that agent that allows me to interact with the vendor. I'm going to upload an invoice, so I'm going to have that prompt here, and here in a second, it's going to ask me to upload that invoice. So I think I've got some caching here. Okay, so it's thinking about it here. There we go. So yes, I want to upload an invoice, and great. Now I'm going to attach that invoice. So you'll notice I've got some invoices that I'm going to use. I'm going to simply drag and drop an invoice that I have into the chat window. Great. Now it's uploading that invoice. I'm going to get a confirmation back from the agent saying, great, I've uploaded the invoice. Give me the invoice name just for confirmation. We're on it. So now it's being ingested into SharePoint Embedded. It knows the project that I'm on. Great. We're going to have some analysis coming back from the agent saying what the invoice is, amount, blah, blah, blah. So metadata, right? Now that we have the metadata that's been extracted, that's going to feed it into an accounting application that I have downstream. So if I go back to my accounting application here, you can see that now I've got the invoice that's been received. Copy the invoice so that I can see exactly what's going on and that metadata information. So we're pulling those invoices from SharePoint Embedded. We're giving the accounting folks the ability to review this, make sure everything is in good order before we pay it. If I have a requirement that I need to provide line item information, great. I can see, what is the line items that were on that invoice, and then put the appropriate GL input there as well. And I can also send this off for approval. So if we have thresholds on certain approval amounts, great, then we can route that for approval within the accounting system. Okay. So this is the accounting app that, of course, feeds from SharePoint Embedded, specifically designed to work with those invoices, have accounting review and pay those. But if I go back to a custom application that I've created, or if I go back to my Power App, we can see that once I go into Contoso, I'm going to go into my files of Contoso. And let's do a refresh here. Okay, so now we go into invoices, and I've got my invoice that's right here. Okay, so that could be a Power App that I've created. Again, I'm using the connector framework to go and get the files for this folder. I'm just talking, very deliberately here, because as we're walking that file tree, each folder and file has an object ID that we're going to use. So if I'm navigating into a folder, get me the folder ID so that I can get the contents of that folder. Contents of the folder could be files, it could be additional folders. That's something that, again, as you're developing that user interface, that's something that you would have to decide how you want to present it to the users. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at what that functionality looks like from Copilot Studio. So if I go into Copilot Studio, you'll notice that I've got a new agent that I've created, and I've got a number of topics that I have associated with this agent. One of the topics is uploading the file to SharePoint Embedded. A couple of things that we need to really double click on here is from the question perspective, I want to be able to upload that file to the agent so that it can perform my action to call that Power Automate activity and put it into the container. When I do this question, this is kind of an important one. If I go to the properties of that question, the one thing that I want to do is, let's see here, entity recognition. I want to make sure that we are using, wait a minute. That's it. This, I think it might be this question. We go to properties here. Oh, no, that was it. Just saw it. Okay, so I'm going to go to properties here. Include file metadata. Okay, so when we include that file metadata, now when I call this action, that metadata is available to me. So now I can say, hey, what is the file name? What is the file contents? Because that's going to be required for Power Automate to execute. Obviously, I need the name because I need to create that in SharePoint Embedded. I need the file contents because I need the bits to get into the container and so forth. So make sure that you have that include file metadata selected so that we can pass that into the action or the tool that's going to execute that. Once we do that, now we're going to see what that tool looks like. So if I go over to tools for that agent, when the agent calls the flow, great. I've got a few parameters or variables that I'm setting there. But again, if I go into the connectors, there's my SharePoint connectors, and there's the 47 different activities that we looked at earlier. Okay. So in this case, I'm simply creating a file. When I create that file, I need to know where am I creating the file. I've got an invoices folder that I want to use to put the files in. Great. What's the ID of that folder? What's the name of the folder that I want to put it in so that we can organize that accordingly? But then I need that container ID. So remember, my containers are multiple projects. Each container has an ID. So I want to make sure that it gets into Project Contoso so that I can organize those files. I don't want it in somebody else's project or container. So I need to specify that. So as you're working with SharePoint Embedded, that container ID is going to be critical so that you can organize it, put it in the right place, security trim it, and so forth. In this case, I also need to provide what's the file name. That is where that include metadata checkbox in Copilot Studio comes in handy. Now it's going to identify what the file name is, and of course that base64 file content. Stream it into the container, all is good. So the next thing I'm doing is taking that invoice, and I'm handing it over to AI Builder, and I'm saying, hey, I've got this invoice. Use the invoice pre-built model to extract the content of that invoice. Now I'm updating the metadata in my container with that invoice information that was extracted. So from an accounting perspective, if we look a little further, that's where we are able to get the metadata so that we can work that through our accounting system. All right, so that was a bit of an overview of SharePoint Embedded. Couple things that we want to focus on. Yeah, we saw how the activities are used within Power Apps, Power Automate, Copilot Studio, first-party connectors that you have available to do all those CRUD operations in SharePoint Embedded with over those 300 file types that we support. Getting started is pretty quick. We have a 2-minute video that you can watch to determine how you want to use that within your environment. We have samples on the Power App that I showed you is one of those samples that I have in GitHub that we'll provide a link to that here shortly. But also we have some scripts and guidance on how to create that SharePoint embedded environment straight away. So you have the ability to create that, use it within your tenant today. All right. Okay. So that is a little bit of an overview on the connectors with SharePoint embedded. John, I haven't been monitoring the chat window here, but if there are any questions, please.
So the first one is, you show document metadata in your Power App, like vendor name. Are these custom metadata fields in SPE, or is that table somewhere else and just paired on the document's ID?
Yeah, great question. When you create that container in SharePoint Embedded, you also have the ability to create metadata in that container. So in that container, I created a metadata field for vendor name, vendor invoice, due date, things like that. So those are, think of that as, simple metadata fields that you would put in a document library. That is the same concept that you can configure within SharePoint Embedded.
Perfect. Just another question there is, how do organizations, how do these connectors align with enterprise compliance requirements such as data resistancy and retention policies?
The connectors that you configure in your environment are subject to any of those policies that you have in your environment now. So if you have those as excluded connectors, there would be a process to get those included. So all of the configuration and compliance safeguards that are in the Power Platform environment today are fully at play with the SharePoint embedded connectors.
Perfect. So where do you see SharePoint embedded sitting within the broader Microsoft Power Platform ecosystem over the next 2-3 years?
Yeah, so where I see it going is where customers are having a bit of a concern is users know how to get to the SharePoint site that may run a Power App today. And what they're doing is they're getting back there and they're like, okay, I'm not going to worry about the Power App and how to do that. I know this document library exists. I'm going to go modify the permissions. I'm going to go delete documents. I'm going to go do something that you don't want the user to do. And then pretty soon they break the site. So we've got customers now that have, a couple thousand people that are using a Power App that's mission critical. You don't want anybody going in there modifying the configuration that could potentially break your Power App. So plus you don't want adverse permissions put on there so that it can be exposed. So think of patents or think of legal documents that are being used. You want to safeguard those. You want to isolate that from the regular SharePoint search. You have a SharePoint embedded container that is isolated. That Power App goes on top of it. you have a truly autonomous application that does what it should do and is not subject to being tampered with, if you will.
Perfect. That looks like all the questions. So on behalf of the ESPC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Steve, for taking time out today to carry this webinar. Really appreciate it.
Good. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, if you have any questions, do reach out to me directly or use the alias that I had mentioned here. And yeah, excited to see what you can do with SharePoint Embedded.
Perfect. So that's the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again for all of you for joining us today. I hope you join us again soon. Take care.